Hello and welcome. My name is Emily Reich, and I'm a design manager at the Center for Academic Innovation. Thank you for joining us today for the Michigan Online Visionary Educators event. From content to community, an emerging framework for recreating learning experiences for a digital world. The MOOCs series is hosted by the Center for Academic Innovation at the University of Michigan. An important part of our mission is to create a more inclusive and global learning community. We believe an informed and peaceful and equitable society is dependent on learners everywhere adopting a learning lifestyle. This monthly series features experts sharing tools, insights, and discussions on issues relevant to the lives of people around the world. Many of the speakers may be familiar to you as they are the faculty behind some of our most successful and innovative learning experiences available through Michigan Online. For more information on upcoming MOOCs series events, please be sure to check out the schedule at online.umich.edu/move. During today's discussion, we invite you to submit questions for our panelists in the Q&A section. You can also upvote the questions that are most interesting to you. Please know that we have a limited time today, so our panelists will do their best to answer as many questions as they can. Additionally, we want you to know that the event will be recorded and made available on Michigan Online. So let's get started. Today, I'm joined by Rebecca Quintana, Learning Experience Design Lead at the Center for Academic Innovation and Adjunct Lecturer at the School of Education. I'm also joined by Don Peurach, Professor of Education at the School of Education. Rebecca and Don, thanks so much for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Emily. It's great to be here. And hello, Don.
Rebecca.
So Don, our topic today is thinking about our shift in our perspective from really focusing on content, as is somewhat natural as educators to really think about the content that we're providing to learners, but shifting that focus from content to community. So I'd love to get us started today by asking you to reflect on when did you first start thinking about this shift or focusing on community rather than content in your work and in your teaching?
Yeah, so let's start thinking about this community idea. So, for me, it really shows up strong in the research work I do and the teaching work I do. The work I do focuses on improving classrooms and schools and districts and systems. And, in this work, the concepts of professional community, democratic community are really absolutely central. And so when you create graduate student experiences on campus that aim to draw people into the work of improving classroom, schools, and systems, it's really imperative that you recreate these professional community and democratic community environments so that aspiring professionals can learn to work within them. And so that's the set of ideas that really I took to the work that we did developing our MicroMasters program in leading educational innovation and improvement. So we started developing it in about 2016. And that was about the time when people were really reflecting on the first iteration of massive open online courses and beginning to think that they were doing very little more than recreating the campus lecture hall in the online space, in contrast to recreating the types of graduate seminars that have always been really central to my work. And so everybody knows the story that, in the massive open online courses conventionally conceived, it's heavy on content presentation, very light on engagement, often discussion boards, very little participation, lack of engagement, sort of problems with presentation led to sort of low completion rates and lower than expected sort of uptake of knowledge and ideas. And so this awareness was sort of there as we began developing our MicroMasters courses. So it was really central to me thinking about, as a professor of education, how can we bring some of the sort of sharpest understandings we have about what really supports high quality graduate instruction, in our case, recreating professional community, democratic community, in graduate classes, how could we bring that into our online course design? So that's what I was really thinking about. When a lot of people start working on online programming, they're thinking about what's the content, how do I present it, how do I make it as lively and engaging as possible? And I was really thinking, well, how can we recreate that on-campus community experience, the professional context community experience in the online environment? So it was with me right from the start. How about you? I mean, when did you start thinking about this?
Right. So I guess if I think back, I started my career as classroom teacher. Like many learning experience designers, a lot of us have experience in classroom initially. And I was a K-12 teacher. I started out off as a visual arts instructor, and then I ended up teaching 6th grade full time. And I had a fairly, I guess, traditional education around teaching, and you've often heard the expression, people sort of teach as they were taught. And so my focus at that time was very much around meeting learning outcomes, but sort of more focused on sort of the content aspect than it might be now. But then I made a transition in my career to higher education, and a key part of that was going to graduate school. I actually left teaching full time because I wanted to immerse myself fully in the graduate student experience. And I did that, fairly, I guess, mid-career, a little bit later than some. It was there that I was first introduced to this idea of a community of learners. My advisor, I ended up doing a PhD in addition to a master's degree, was really heavily influenced by the work of educational psychologist Anne Brown, and her work on fostering a community of learners was just a central part of what we did within my research lab. So fostering a community of learners is when learners are working together around a shared topic of interest, really inquiring, trying to make progress on understanding. It's not necessarily the teacher that has the answers and is delivering the instruction or the content, but it's really the learners that come together, and they have a collective responsibility for content mastery. In addition to this, sometimes individuals within that community will take responsibility for becoming an expert in a certain aspect of the topic that is being discovered together. So this kind of drove my PhD research, which really was centered in K-6 science classrooms and simulation environments, which were quite stimulating and interesting, but the real focus was on our use of digital technologies to allow students to contribute to this shared knowledge base. And what they were seeing, what they were observing, what they were discovering within this simulation environment was being captured by them and input into a very sort of carefully designed series of instruction. And it allowed us to create these shared representations of community knowledge. So it wasn't just the individual knowledge that was displayed, it was the collective knowledge. And this became a tool for instructors to use to kind of help lead the community forward in their shared understanding of these science topics. And hopefully individual students could see themselves situated within that shared display, so they could see maybe where their observation fit within the larger picture. So those were some really influential things in helping me understand the importance of really focusing and centering on community rather than content. So I'll be explaining a bit later, how that has translated to the higher education context. But I started off in the elementary school context.
See, that's where we sort of picked it up. I mean, where you were just mentioning in the higher ed context. And the matter was, that we were thinking about is, how do you recreate the types of sort of engaged learning experiences for practicing professional teachers, school leaders who want to get deeper into the work of leading educational innovation and improvement, in the way that you were describing drawing science learners into that sort of engaged collective learning. And when we were developing our MicroMasters program, I was working with Catherine Gabriel, close colleague and great friend, to conceptualize how we were going to do that in a massive open online course, or a series of them, the rub of which at the time was that these things were sort of amenable to anything but that. So we sort of stepped back and started to think, well, can we come up with a core instructional model that we could really pull through all of our courses that would really engage people in and around the problems of improving schools and systems collectively in the work of improving them. And so we developed a model that we called self-directed community-supported learning. And so the intent of this model was to preserve some of the conventional ways that learners expect to engage content online, that is through principles of transfer-oriented pedagogies or the XMOOC instructional designs, and to really complement those with new opportunities for community engagement by leveraging principles of CMOOC or connectivist learning experiences. So with this model that we call self-directed community-supported learning, each lesson consists of 4 components. It begins with what we call the presentation component. And this preserves a little bit what you were talking about how you sort of learned to teach when you were being taught. This is content presentation. In our case, video presentation, interviews with experts, interviews with practitioners. And we match that with a study guide to really structure students' attention in and around the content that was being presented, both to sort of reinforce the experience of watching it, but to also tee up collective conversation later in the lesson. We follow that with what we call an enrichment component. This is a kind of guided web exploration that really sort of builds out our content presentation by directing students to different places, different people, different resources online that really reinforce, again, the content. The real turn, though, was that we then shift students into what we call team practice exercises. These are teaching cases engaged by small teams of learners online. And the intent here was to really recreate the professional context of leading educational innovation and improvement. We want practicing educational professionals to co-engage in the work. So these teaching cases are designed to do 2 things. One is it draws students together. It creates an opportunity for conversation. We structure some initial discourse where people use their study guides to begin reconciling differences in understanding in the content. But the big move is to really begin to apply sort of principles and practices from the presentation component to the solving of an authentic leadership problem. And the idea here is that this is going to take people out of a passive role and really have them debating, contending, thinking together, designing, developing together solutions. And the yield of this is an actual artifact that they can include in a portfolio that represents their new collective professional understanding. But another yield for that is sort of, we hope, confidence. The idea that from this team practice component, students can shift into what we call a clarification component. And this is the more conventional online discussion board where people really bring thorny questions to the whole group. But in this case, it wouldn't be individual learners bringing their own questions. People are often intimidated by that. This would be teams of learners bringing sort of matters that they haven't yet been able to resolve in their team practice exercise to the entire group for collective conversation. And we think that and hope and sort of theorize that that's just a different way of scaffolding people into a kind of collective community engagement. It's more inviting than when individuals have to somehow find voice and sort of elbow their way in and speak up. So from this clarification component, then we shift into something we call community engagement. This is strong encouragement for learners to begin to engage with the broader community of other learners and professionals who've gone through these courses, both to take themselves and their ideas sort of quote unquote out there and to become a member of that broader community. This is the professional community into which we hope they gain entree when they complete our courses. So again, we start out with massive open online courses as you would expect to encounter them, a lot of content presentation, but we scaffold students through a series of different community engagement opportunities that are meant to take them from their team members to their course members to the whole broader community. And so this model, this self-directed community supported learning is the sort of backbone design of the core program, the core courses that really anchor our MicroMasters program in leading educational innovation and improvement. So I mean, if we've done this, if we've sort of chewed on this, given what you said about your work as a graduate student, your subsequent work as in the Center for Academic Innovation, how are you taking these principles of community engagement, community learning into the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, thanks for that, Don. So just as you were speaking about, the sort of conventional vision of an XMOOC and sort of the focus on content presentation, which comes very naturally given the the features that are available in our MOOC platforms. I was always constantly thinking, how can we sort of push a little bit on those feature sets? How can we create creative participant structures as you have described? So I guess one example I could give is when I was given the opportunity to actually design and teach a MOOC on the Coursera platform. It's called Resilient Teaching Through Times of Crisis and Change. So not only have I been afforded the opportunity to support faculty such as yourself in creating experiences, it was kind of a different experience to be the one teaching this particular course. I endeavored to integrate these perspectives around community-oriented instruction in that design. I will say, we did develop this course as a team, so there were many involved, not just myself, at the center, and we conceptualized it and developed it right at the start of the pandemic. So, there was a lot going on, and we did it within a fairly short amount of time. But right from the beginning, we wanted to put out a call, and we wrote a blog post. James Devaney and I wrote a blog post for Inside Higher Education, and we put out this call and said, we're developing this course for instructors, for instructional designers. We're in this very unique time together. What would you like to see in a course about resilient teaching? What kinds of ideas or examples or information or structures, participant structures, would be important for you if you were to take this course? And we received a pretty good response to that survey, and Jacob Fortman, a colleague of mine, and I kind of collected all of those responses and really tried to use those to help shape both sort of the content of the course, but also the way that the course was designed. And you mentioned discussion prompts as kind of one of the primary means that we have within MOOC platforms to engage learners in conversation with each other. And we certainly use those quite frequently throughout the course, but we also wanted to give learners kind of a more private space for them to reflect. We think reflection is also a very important part of learning. And we were able to integrate a digital tool that had been recently developed at the Center for Academic Innovation called the Gamut Workbook Tool. I think this may have been the first course that used this particular tool. And we were able to index workbook prompts, so prompts to our learners for reflection, according to the course structure. So it's strategic points. After a lecture, for instance, there would then be a workbook prompt that kind of followed up on that particular topic. And the idea was that by completing all of the prompts within the workbook, the learner would be led toward designing and completing their own resilient teaching plan. So it was kind of carefully structured to help them and scaffold them in achieving that particular goal. But interestingly, the workbook itself was both a place for private reflection, but also if learners chose to, they could make their reflections available to the community of learners. Some learners chose to do that, some did not, and depending on the prompt, some chose to share and some did not. So that was one way we were trying to kind of create opportunities for sharing, not just sharing, but once those learners did choose to share, they could interact around those particular prompts. So that's one way that I've been thinking about community within my work at the Center for Academic Innovation. I could also talk a little bit maybe about my role as a lecturer at the School of Education as well, where I've also been taking this idea of community approaches to instruction, both in large classes, whether it be a class of 80 students in an undergraduate class or smaller graduate classes. So we've used a lot of things like social annotation tools, even before the pandemic, with our larger classes. And it's so interesting as an instructor to read the comments of students around readings and hear their ideas as individuals, where you may not have an opportunity to hear from every student in a large class, but you can with this type of an experience, and then use that as the basis for your teaching the following class to kind of be able to bring in their perspectives in a very natural and authentic way. think I might stop there because I feel like you may have.
Just
Yeah,
a question to you. I mean, in these different contexts, your campus-based learning, your online learning, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what it really takes to sort of motivate students to sort of begin engaging with each other. I mean, you know, you've sort of probably had the experience that I've had both as a teacher and a learner in a room where somebody says, now take a minute to talk about these things, and everybody sort of sits there in a sort of stony silence until you sort of somehow find a way to control them and to begin sort of interacting. It seems that, you know, availing opportunities for community is not the same as taking advantage of those opportunities. And I'm wondering if you've noticed any sort of particulars in your online work and your campus-based work that are really key to getting students to buy into this idea of community.
Yeah, well, that's such a wonderful question. So, you know, right off the bat, right at the beginning of a class, I will present this idea of a learning community to the students, and I'll sort of explain what I did earlier about, you know, the notion of fostering communities of learners and what all of that entails. I might also introduce a question that we might consider together as a class. So, for instance, I recently taught a course about augmented and virtual reality in educational contexts. And the question that we posed was, you know, what are the claims that are being made about this technology in support of learning? And, you know, what can we learn from research and other sources about whether those claims, you know, can be supported or not? So by kind of introducing this question and keeping that at the forefront, and also leaving room for learners to introduce, you know, maybe new topics or new ideas, not having the course design so tight that it's not possible to allow those things to surface and to actually focus on them in a meaningful way, I think is one way that I've been able to kind of get that buy-in from students in terms of trying to really convey that, you know, when we say we are a community of learners, we mean that. And even as an instructor, I am learning from them. And that can be sometimes challenging, you know, to sort of put yourself out there in that way. But I've always found it to be very rewarding and very worthwhile.
That's been a little bit of my experience too. But what's kind of been my experience in, again, the context of most of my work is these sort of massive open online courses intended to serve practicing professionals. Like the idea that you're trying to create community is sort of counter-normative. I mean, it's not what people expect when they sign up for a MOOC. I mean, this is something that's sort of there at their convenience. It's, you know, something that they can sort of do between the cracks of their days or mornings or evenings. And so, you know, when you present to them the idea that now they really have to kind of become active and engaged and really, you know, start to work with others in the class, you know, it can really kind of, you know, challenge the set of assumptions and expectations that they brought in with them. And, you know, it was that one of that was one of the worries that we had on our mind when we really sort of had the idea that we were going to begin designing for community. But I mean, one of the things we've learned is that, you know, it really is possible to recreate community, even in a massive open online course, in ways that get students much more deeply engaged in the content, much more deeply engaged in the application of the content in practice contexts. But I mean, among the things that we've learned is that, you know, we really need to work hard, like you were just describing, to establish some really important enabling conditions on the front end, so that, you know, that this is possible. One, again, is this sort of, you know, instructional model that intentionally structures students' experiences in ways that support community. But one of the biggest success stories we've had is by taking cohorts of learners through our massive open online courses together. This is cohorts of both campus-based and online learners going through these courses together, collectively identifying as a cohort, being identified by us as a cohort, named, privileged, called the winter cohort, the spring cohort. And, you know, with that, setting a clear weekly schedule that we expect
Mhm.
people to move through. We monitor that, we support that, we motivate that. When we did that, I sent out a message every Monday morning to kind of, put the spurs to people and to really get their attention to say, we're going to be moving together this week to work on these things. I mean, another thing we learned is that voluntary participation in online learning of this sort is like really, really important. People need to be
Mhm.
excited and motivated and predisposed to community-based learning and bought in. And one of the things that we've learned, in some cases a hard way, is this is really important because sort of correcting for the opposite in the online space can be really difficult. When social issues arise in the online space, when there's problems in motivation and commitment and buy-in
Mhm.
that have some students both, either challenging the design or sort of not working well together, like, fixing those things is super hard when you're in a regular classroom, and it's really super,
Mhm.
super hard when you're online. And we learned that if you ask people to form teams, you need to support them in doing that. There's all
Right.
kinds of upfront logistics that need to be sort of arranged given different people's schedules and time zones.
Mhm.
And then, you need to be able to sort of structure some way to ensure that people have a good fit with those with whom they're going to be working closest. I mean, it's no different online than it is in the classroom. If you're sort of getting that vibe right out of the gate that this isn't going to be the most productive grouping, and people need to be free to move around, but in the online space they really need a lot of help doing that navigating. So that's another enabling condition, kind of that
Mhm.
support for team building. And then once you have teams, it's no different than in any other context. People need to learn to work together as a team. They need to develop norms and expectations around their collective work. You need to work with
Mhm.
them to develop their weekly and daily routines. In a lot of cases, the courses that we've developed really ask students to stretch beyond the capabilities of the online platform. So we have to kind of support them in moving on off platform to other cloud-based computing platforms to do a lot of their work. And then another thing we found is that it's really important to structure some downtime, because people, asking people to move along together and they need some kind of downtime to get in sync. But if you structure these enabling conditions along with a really careful design, it's been really gratifying. I mean, we've learned that you can really, really get people working online in ways that you might not have suspected. And this has been a positive enough
Mhm.
experience in our MicroMasters. Others in the School of Education have experienced the kind of community engagement in positive ways, so much so that Rebecca, and to everybody here, Rebecca and I and another
Mhm.
in a team in the School of Education have really been getting together to start to think about how can we really recreate the entire School of Education community as
Mhm.
a sort of vibrant online national global kind of professional community of educators, families, advocates, policy people who collectively identify. And so we want to create this community and then sort of use that community as a foundation for collegial learning. We want to develop opportunities for big public engagement, town halls and policy forums. We want to develop a new kind of MicroMasters that supports this community by laying out principles of practices that we think are really integral to large scale improvement. We want to draw this community into continuing professional learning opportunities of the sort that teachers are often required to take. And we want to take this community and pull it further into graduate certificates and course taking. So again, these little wins have really inspired kind of big vision. And our next steps are really to kind of kick it up a little bit and a lot and really kind of front a kind of community-based practice forward approach to online learning. And that's going to be the 2.0 version of all of this stuff. So again, we started kind of doubting ourselves when we set out down this road, but the payoff's been big and the vision's growing with the payoff. How's it been for you? I mean, has it been a challenge? Have you had successes? What have you learned?
Yeah, I feel like we're kind of at a point where, as we're thinking about returning possibly to in-person learning, I feel like we've learned so much over the past year and a half, and so much of it was positive. There really was a lot that I want to be able to carry forward, into my future teaching, but also into my future design work. One idea that comes to mind is just the ability within online and digital spaces to share various artifacts, knowledge artifacts, to be able to interact with those, through commenting, through reading in a very sort of natural way. It's very easy to kind of distribute those things, collect those things, and then maybe redistribute them in different combinations. And as we move, back to in-person learning, I want to be able to continue to take this idea of dynamic knowledge construction that was able to be done digitally in various types of environments, but be able to do that in an authentic and kind of natural way in person and hybrid spaces too. I don't know exactly what our teaching context will look like, but there's just so much to be learned from this ability to be able to converse fluently, to be able to build on each other's ideas. And I think what it is that we're able to share the floor more, right? Everyone's able to contribute, whereas kind of in our turn taking in face-to-face, it might be one or two or only a few students that can really, participate or share their ideas. But with digital spaces, it's so much easier for everyone to be able to ask a question or to respond to a question. Just as I'm sure we're doing now within our webinar here, and we will turn to some of our questions soon. But in a face-to-face presentation, that wouldn't be possible for everyone to sort of talk at once in that way. So I'm hoping that we can kind of continue to put the focus on the community and community knowledge construction.
In your work, with this focus on community, one of the things that I wonder is do you feel that in returning to campus, if we end up back at campus and people go back completely to sort of face-to-face learning, that they'll be giving up opportunities for community that are available online that would be tough to recreate in the campus space? I say this sort of with a particular idea in mind. Like, one of the things that's been fascinating to me in trying to develop community online are the sort of unlikely communities that form. So we've had campus-based learners working with who are in a master's program, working with community and parent advocates in other parts of the country, working with professional educators in other countries, with leaders and entrepreneurs on other continents. That online, there have been opportunities for a real sort of richness in community that would be lost sort of obversely by coming back face to face. And so, I wonder if you've had any experiences where you've had rich community experiences online and you worry about recreating the online richness in the campus space.
Yeah. Just as you were talking, I was thinking, one concern could be that our communities will get smaller as if we move back to fully in person. And it's been wonderful to be able to expand, even in a classroom setting, who we're interacting with. An example that comes to mind was actually at the end of the winter semester of last year. So, just kind of again at the beginning of the pandemic, where the class started in person and then transitioned to fully online. And we were working on various design projects, and students were in groups and had worked together in their small group for the entire semester to develop these really interesting digital technologies for education. And so for our last class, I invited each student to invite someone that they admired. It could be in a professional context, it could be a professor, to the final class. And we did schedule it so that all of the guests could attend a short segment, not the entire class, but they were welcome to if they wanted to. And every single person we asked said yes. And it was just so rich to have the students presenting their work and having, they were so pleased to be able to introduce the person that they had invited, and that person would ask questions and give feedback. I can't imagine, sort of being able to do that nimbly in the same way in a face-to-face setting. And, people might think they would need to attend, and then perhaps they would decline the invitation just because of the logistics and the time involved. But yeah, it's just opened up many, many opportunities like that. That's only a small example. But I hope we can keep some of that, keeping our communities broader and inviting more people in rather than feeling that it needs to be kept small.
Yeah, that's exactly what I find myself thinking. Absolutely, because boy, oh boy, I tell you, some of the sort of, again, the richness of community that I experienced online was both unexpected and difficult to sort of create in any other way.
Yeah.
So at this point in our conversation, we were thinking that it'd be fun and interesting to start to shift our attention from our experiences to the questions that people in attendance and who registered have. So we received a bunch of questions in advance. We know that you've been entering questions in the chat, in the Q&A. And, Rebecca and I sat down and we started to kind of parse through the questions that people asked in advance. Many thanks to those who submitted them. And as we sorted through them, they seemed to fall into a few big categories. There were general design questions. There were questions about increasing cognitive demand and student engagement in the way that we've been talking about. Questions about designing and managing the coordination between asynchronous and synchronous learning opportunities in ways that promoted community while also favoring content. Questions about supporting ambitious learning, not only in academic contexts, but also in professional and in business contexts. And people were also asking questions about matters of equity in online learning, especially for historically marginalized students. And Rebecca, I thought it'd be fun to start with a question from one of our participants, which is really like the big fundamental question. It's a design question and it's pretty wide open. It's what's the biggest challenge in your experience for creating rich digital online learning experiences?
So I'm gonna address that question from the perspective of learning at scale. And recently we've been thinking a lot about ideas from universal design for learning, where we focus on the idea of learner variability. We know that within our classroom contexts, within our work contexts, each of us varies greatly in terms of the needs that we might have, our goals for engagement, ways that we like to interact with information, ways that we like to express what we know. But when we think about it at scale, that learner variability is going to be even greater. So, a challenge is how within massive open online courses, for instance, the MOOC series that you were describing earlier, or the resilient teaching MOOC, how can you meet the needs of learners at scale? I feel like that is one of our greatest challenges. We can't possibly know each of our learners in advance. We can have an idea of perhaps who might join the course or who might be interested in the course, and we can kind of think about design in that way. Also, within massive open online courses, we don't necessarily have the ability to shift if we sense that things need to be adjusted depending on how learners are interacting with the course. We kind of have to make sure the design is complete right at the beginning, right at the start, and that can be difficult for community-oriented instruction, where the voice of the community is such a central part to that. So I think, being able to address the needs of our large audiences of learners who are varied and unique individuals is probably our greatest challenge. And I'm also scanning through the questions here, and I noticed there's several questions actually about ambitious learning in professional and business contexts. And I know that's an area that you've probably been doing quite a lot of thinking about, particularly since many of your MicroMasters learners are practicing teachers and educational leaders. So again, any thoughts on this matter from the perspective of content and community?
Yeah, I mean, the matter here is that I've experienced is that the content isn't sort of facts or sort of simple processes. It's sort of complex social practice when you talk about improving classrooms, schools, and systems, especially those that have been sort of mired in dysfunction for some amount of time. This is, what you need to develop people's capabilities to do is to sort of co-enact with colleagues really complex social improvement processes so that the sort of content is practice. It's sort of, ways of working. And, in an online space, that there's limits to kind of talking about practice in principle, and there are limits to presenting the sort of theory that sits behind these practices. There's limits to kind of modeling how you might enact practices, and there's a real need to recreate online types of learning communities and professional communities in which teachers and leaders co-enact these complex improvement practices sort of in authentic contexts. And this, again, is what drove us into reading about teaching cases and case methods of teaching, into the development of our team practice exercises as teaching cases. And these are designed to put learners in different professional roles, to give them different identities in those roles, and to have them take on authentic leadership challenges using the principles, methods, and practices that they've learned in the course. And so, designing those experiences is really, really tricky. It's just as tricky online as it is in person. Creating a kind of teaching case that's sort of developmentally appropriate, given what you were just saying, you may have learners from very different professional backgrounds. But another thing is, again, as I was saying before, sort of getting learners bought into this. They get into a massive open online course or an online learning experience expecting to be able to step back and really saying, no, you got to step forward, and you got to step into these teaching cases and sort of live them as if they were your authentic work context. Now, that's been, for me, for designing for practicing professionals in the education sector, one of the matters is sort of recreating the professional experience sort of online. And I guess we could, and the famous sort of cases of these sorts are typically sort of run in business schools, and but it's drawing on those and other sort of sources of the case method that have sat behind our efforts. So those were some of the questions that we received from our participants, you in advance when you logged in. We're going to try to do that ambidextrous thing that you need to do when doing a webinar like this time, and turn our attention to the Q&A and see if there's a couple of questions that have, and again, as you read through the questions yourself, feel free to upvote them so they kind of come to the top and we can get our mitts on them. So this first one, do you want me to take this one on? I have a question at the top here.
Go ahead.
From Diana, that says, I'd love to hear from the speakers how they've handled the natural tension between content focused and community, content focus and community focus, especially as it relates to kind of collective knowledge. For example, how do we wrestle with prioritize what a group knows or can do versus what an individual member of that group knows and can do? And I saw another question farther down that centered on assessment. And I kind of read this as an assessment question. I don't know if you had a chance to about this, but
I had a different connection. So I don't know if would you like to start with?
You can give it a rip. You can give it a
okay.
shot.
So I was also looking at some of the other questions here, which seem related about the distinction between the individual and the group. Questions of, can you think of when it may not be beneficial to try to cultivate or create a community in a MOOC? And that's a really interesting question, because we know learners come to our experiences with various motivations, and as you described earlier, Don, it may come as a surprise to a learner to say we're going to engage in sort of this community approach. Some learners may in fact have individual goals that may include sort of efficiency and moving through material in a way that allows them to perhaps meet a professional goal and may not necessarily want to engage in the type of experience that we've described. So, the question of, is a peer review really necessary in a MOOC? It can be frustrating sometimes for learners who are waiting for feedback and so on. So I guess my response to that is, it really does come down to kind of what the learning goals might be for that individual course, which, the instructor might sort of devise at the outset of a course. And, in some cases, particularly if it's the type of course that's teaching a skill that can be tested through, machine graded assessment, there you go. Maybe that would be fine. Maybe it isn't necessary to always think about this community approach, but I do still think it's important to have some connection point, some opportunity for learners to be able to ask questions and receive responses from learners, because we do know that learning can best occur through opportunities for social interaction. So yeah, but I don't know if you have another sort of tact on that particular question.
I read the question a little bit differently. I mean, I kind of read it from from one who does a lot of group work in class, like, when people are working in teams and, the kind of product is collective, it's a shared product. There's a matter of how do you sort of do two things. One is figure out like who learned what among the team members. And then sort of there's sort of kind of an accountability and kind of attribution problem. Like, was this sort of done with equal effort among all involved, or did some own the task and some sort of shirk, and so on. So the way that we approach this, both in our online design and and I do it in face-to-face too, is there's the matter of assessing the collective product for its value. I put less of a premium on that. I mean, what you're hoping to do there is to really push people to push themselves, and then you get cross-group talk going to kind of elevate. But the assessment matter, is for me, involves sort of developing an individual assessment as a complement to the group product. So in our MicroMasters, the capstone exercise has people bringing forward their group artifacts, but there are individual assessment components that students must successfully complete also. And it's through the individual assessment that we get the keenest sort of angle on what students have learned and what they understand and what they don't understand. And so the matter is to complement, in my experience, the sort of community group product with individual assessment and accountability. That's where I get the best angle. And I come at this less from an accountability perspective and more from a formative perspective. Who's getting what and what more can I do to help them get more? But trying to extract that from a group effort can be kind of really tough. And if you set up a kind of a thing where team members will kind of mutually assess on each other's contributions, that can be as destructive as it is productive. So it's this kind of complementary assessment at the individual level that's been really, really important for me.
Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I have also found my sort of thinking around assessment changing a little bit recently, particularly with, recent events and sort of being sensitive to learners who are, in various situations and could be perhaps struggling. And that is, I've sort of moved away from providing letter grades almost altogether, and really just providing a set of, here's some specifications, here's what, we'd like to see you do through this particular assessment, and then really focusing on the feedback, really focusing on, what it might be that they could improve. Of course, the challenge is when we think about at scale learning, that is not possible for an individual instructor to do. So we have a lot more thinking to do in terms of how to provide meaningful feedback in online context, I think.
We did,
large scale.
In those cohort designs where you're dealing, one of the things we did manage to do, I think with some level of success, was sort of peer feedback mechanisms, just using straightforward, like looking at student work protocols that people use
Exemplars.
to
Yeah.
exactly sort of
Yeah.
move their work among each other and provide structured feedback. But
Yeah.
I agree that kind of backing off hardcore of summative assessment in favor of warm and cool feedback is feels safer for a lot of students, feels better for me sometimes. I think that, well, on cue comes Emily. I was going to say, I think that we're kind of reaching the end here. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, for the questions that we've received, they're really rich. We were sorry not to get to them all, but we do appreciate all of the thoughtfulness in the Q&A.
Very much so. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, Rebecca and Don. Thanks so much for joining us and sharing all of that wonderful insight. To our participants, thank you for joining us and submitting all of your questions. You can check out the upcoming MOOC topics guests online at umich.edu/MOOC. And then for the latest course offerings, events, and conversations, you can follow Michigan Online on our social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. If this topic was interesting to you, I'd encourage you to take part in some of the courses we have online, such as Resilient Teaching Through Times of Crisis and Change, as well as Leading Educational Innovation and Improvement. Thank you all for joining us and learning with us today. We hope you'll join us for our upcoming events.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.